In this video, I've been asked to talk about writer's block. What is writer's block, and how do you overcome this problem that so many writers seem to really struggle with? Because many writers, what they'll do is they have an idea, they got the big idea for a story, and that might start as some kind of plot-oriented situation. Maybe they've got an idea for a character or some kind of thematic idea they want to express. Maybe they even just have a vision for a scene, a really cool scene. Maybe a relationship. And you've got this foundational concept, this idea that you now want to express bring out into a story. And what most writers do is they will start writing. Right? Almost right away they start writing. And more sophisticated writers will probably try to break down their story. In fact, they'll try to break down the story using a timeline that looks like this. And there are many versions of this. This is a pretty simple version based on 3 acts. There are versions that are based on 4 acts. There's experts who will say this is Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and Act 4. And then there are experts who break it down to 6 acts, and 12 acts. And it doesn't make a difference how many acts. Because ultimately what they're doing is still expressing the idea for a story in a very flat, narrow, linear way. And it's images like this. And thinking through the process of writing with ideas like this that are causing you to have writer's block, severe writer's block. Because this is not what happens in great stories. Because the problem is that even if you take the time to figure out all the note cards, you line up all the note cards, you figure out what's the inciting incident. Well, here's my character. I'll set up my character. And then the situation, there's some kind of circumstance that's going to happen to them, right? The inciting incident, we introduce that. And then we bring them up to the plot point. And then we move over to the big twist at the plot point, just a twist, a big whammo or twist at the plot point. Get to the midpoint, another major twist, which is not what happens at the midpoint at all. It could be a major twist. But the truth is, we can be very specific. We know exactly what needs to happen at a midpoint. In fact, in great stories, from the moment the story begins, you're not going to the ending. This is one of the reasons people struggle with writer's block, because they're trying to get from the setup to the climax. And the first thing you need to do is understand you need to get from the setup to the midpoint, and then from the midpoint to the climax. But this video is not about that. I want to stay focused. Because, if you watch my videos, I tend to all over the place. I want to talk about writer's block. Because the reason you have writer's block is because you are not thinking about your stories correctly. That's why you struggle with writer's block. Because you haven't taken the time to really understand your story correctly. And even if you have not built a properly, deeply layered story. Or maybe you are using some kind of timeline that looks like this. And this timeline, Joseph Campbell's, his monomyth, is completely insufficient to build a well thought out, deep, relevant story. It may be fine for looking at ancient mythological stories or even looking at stories after the fact, but to think through your own stories using this kind of timeline is a recipe for writer's block. You see, this leads to writer's block. This leads to writer's block. The better way to think about your story is what we teach in Your Storytelling Potential. And that's to understand your stories like this. And before you start writing, to understand all of the stuff that is represented in this image. First of all, to understand the situation, the major plot-oriented situation that is driving the story. Not the main character does not drive a story. Anyone who believes the main character or teaches that the main character drives a story is 100% incorrect. We can look at all the great stories of the last 50 years, and you will rarely find stories where the main character drives the story. And I know there's going to be somebody, because I just said that will email me examples where the main character, in fact, they'll claim drives the story. And most of those examples that people send me, the main character does not drive the story. I've got some actual examples where the main character does drive the story. But in most great stories, the main character doesn't drive the story. The first thing, if you want to overcome writer's block, is to understand who is the proximate cause character who truly drives the plot part of the story that we call the A story. And then you need to understand all the stuff, all the reality that's flowing into the now. This is the part of the story you write. But there's so much that flows from the past, both in terms of the A story and the B story, flows from the past into what we call the now, into the revealed present. And that's what you're writing. And you need to understand all of this stuff before you write. And you have to understand the destination, what we call the revealed potential, not a character arc. The idea of a character arc is a poorly chosen set of words that describe the transformation that a main character undergoes. A revealed potential, as I teach in your storytelling potential, is such a sharper, better, more meaningful, more actionable way to think about the character arc. We call it a revealed potential. And what you need to do is know all this stuff. And then understanding, let me jump ahead here, understanding these 12 core elements. These are all the what's of your story. When you figure out all the what's of your story, rather than using this thin line that represents only one component of the story, and there's no depth at all there. It's just narrow way of thinking about stories. This lets you think about all the what's. It lets you think at that 30,000-foot view, gets your mind out of that box, and lets you really understand what is happening in the A story, what is happening in the B story, what is the main character all about, what is the depth, the thematic richness, the thematic relevance, the deeply rooted whys. And then when you know all that, you can write great dialogue, because you're going to know exactly what your characters need to say, which will get you out of writer's block. And this idea of subtext, this foolish idea of these morons teaching, writing, that will tell you that subtext is when a character says one thing, but they mean something else. Unless the character is intentionally lying. All characters do not say one thing and mean something else. That's not good dialogue, and that's not what subtext means. Subtext means that there is a deeply rooted thematic idea that is layered within what your characters are saying, but they are saying what they mean. They're not liars, unless they are a psychopathic liar. Well, if your character's a psychopathic liar, then maybe they'll say something and mean something else. But for all your other characters, they say what they mean. They express what they want. And there's a deeply rooted thematic ideas at play. And that's what this represents. And when you think about all this, then when you start writing, because this is all the what's, this is the who's, this is the why's, then you figure out the when's, when things happen, when all this stuff has to happen. Then what happens is when you sit down and write, you will not nearly have the struggles that we call writer's block. So if you want to overcome writer's block, the better way to think about your stories, to understand and think about your core elements of your story. And again, I teach these ideas in my book, Your Storytelling Potential. They're all explored in depth, and I show you a step-by-step way to implement these ideas, and you actually get these work. This is one of the worksheets. You get many different worksheets to help you think through all the different parts of your story, including the structure, including the timeline, and then also my software plot control. And there's also chapter control for writing novels, and it will literally walk you through the process of understanding, starting with the core elements, building out all the different relationships and subplots and different storylines that are required to write a great story, and eventually you get to a meaningful timeline and outline. And when you have that, and you understand why all the characters are doing what they are doing, and you understand the deeply thematic, rich ideas that are at play, when you sit down to write, you will not have the struggles called writer's block.